very grateful for the invitation. It's always a delight for me to be here and to experience the extraordinary warm welcome. Not only this time, my first visit to Zurich was over 30 years ago, and in that time I have known many people who have been extraordinarily generous with their time and their learning. After the beautiful textual treatment by Dr. Hild this morning and the colorful images provided by Torrance Kirby, I want to do something a little different. I'm going to take on the whole of the 19th century and give you a very broad picture. I'm going to creep a little bit into the 20th century, but give you a very broad picture of the ways in the Anglo-Saxon American world, some of the perspectives on Zwingli that were part of a renewed interest in the Reformation. But I begin with two very different 19th century perspectives on the Reformation in Zurich. First, the death of Zwingli is a heroic tragedy. He died for God and for his country. He was a martyr of religious liberty and of the independence of Switzerland. He was right in his aim to secure the freedom of preaching in all the cantons and bailiwicks, and to abolish the military pensions which had made the Swiss tributary to foreign masters. Then, in contrast, if God was with Luther, he was not with Zwingli. If he was with Zwingli, he was certainly could not be with Luther. God is the God of order and not of confusion, and the truth is one and indivisible, and not manifold and contradictory. The first quotation is from the famous Swiss church historian and churchman Philip Schaff, whose history of the Reformation was of enormous influence on Protestant writers of the 19th century and of the early 20th century, and as we all know, continues to be read today. The second, distinctly less positive voice is that of Martin John Spalding, the Catholic Ultramontane Archbishop of Baltimore, who in the early 1870s wrote a multi-volume refutation of another great Swiss historian, Jean-Henri Merle d'Aubigné, whose history of the Reformation in the 16th century had been reissued in English in 1861 and 1862. I shall return to both writers later in my talk, but first to my purpose. Some years ago, I explored in a short book the many lives of John Calvin in the 19th century, arguing that renewed interest in the Reformation was deeply entangled with contemporary debates and anxieties about liberalism, modernism, and secularism. Today, I turn to Huldrych Zwingli in much the same vein, but to tell a slightly different story about the reception and reimagination of the Reformation in a period of intense pressures on and within both the Protestant and Catholic churches. The volume of material is simply overwhelming, consisting of a large number of translations of European works into English, intense public interest in the Reformation fueled by numerous celebrations of anniversaries, and in this respect, this paper belongs very closely to what Christian Moser is going to do later today, and the developing discipline of church history in the theological faculties in both Britain and America. This afternoon, I shall offer a small selection of authors who addressed key themes that emerged in the presentation of Zwingli in the 19th and early 20th century. These themes speak to contemporary concerns in the Anglo-American world about questions, as I say, as church and modernity, church-state relations, nationalism, and religious war. Further, we can place the writing about Zwingli in the context of intense debates about confessional and historical identity, in which Lutherans, Catholics, and Reformed returned ad fontes to the Reformation as a battleground for their own contested relations in the 19th century. The Reformation anniversary played a key role in these confessional processes of identity, but so did questions debates over liberal and orthodox theologians, the development of Vatican I, the Tractarian movement, and the founding, for instance, of the Parker Society, all of which served as catalysts for the flow of publications on the Reformation. In the English-speaking world, it has been commonplace, even to our time, to refer to Huldrych Zwingli as the forgotten reformer. And to a certain degree, the label is appropriate. The last major and full biography in English dates from the mid-1970s, the work of George Potter. And although Zwingli has never disappeared from view, much of the same information and stories tend to be rehearsed, offering little in the way of new perspectives. The situation in the 19th century was somewhat different. There was a diverse range of sources for the renewed interest in Zwingli in that century. Perhaps the most influential was the English translation of the already mentioned Aubigné's History of the Reformation, which began appearing in the 1840s and continued to be reprinted throughout the century. Aubigné, in his preface to the 1846 English edition, offers some insight on the confessional conflicts in America that surrounded the translation of his work. I'm going to provide quite a few quotations here. Daubigné writes, "At the end of the year 1844, I received several letters from the United States informing me that besides 75,000 copies of my history put in circulation by different American booksellers, the American Tract Society had printed an edition of 24,000 copies, which sold through the instrumentality of more than 100 hawkers, colporteurs, principally in the new settlements, which no bookseller can reach, but whither the Pope never ceases not from sending active emissaries. They acted that the committee of this society, composed of different denominations, and among others of Episcopalians and Baptists, were rendered uneasy by certain passages in my history, and had thought proper, with the best intentions, either to modify or retrench them. They informed me, lastly, that 2 Presbyterian synods, astonished at these changes in his book, had publicly accused the society of mutilating my work. That there had arisen, wrote one of the most respectable men in the United States, himself a Presbyterian, and not a member of the society, so violent a discussion that, quote, the committee will inevitably be ruined unless you interfere to rescue it. Such was the level of controversy surrounding competing narratives of the Reformation. And part of the controversy surrounding Daubigné's surrounding Daubigné's book was his highly positive portrayal of Huldrych Zwingli, a perspective enhanced to English readers 10 years later in 1856 with the highly successful translation of Johann Jakob Hottinger's 1842 biography. The tone of Hottinger's work became a model for subsequent Protestant portraits of the Reformer. In Thomas Porter's translation, Hottinger spoke of Zwingli's character and of his own role as a biographer of Zwingli. Not for one moment, Hottinger writes, did Zwingli falter in the path which he had marked out for himself. Though his faith continued firm and strong to the hour of his death, still there lay also in his character a spirit of worldly prudence which rendered intolerable the thought of becoming a sacrifice to the craft of his opponents, who instead of honoring his courage would rather perhaps have laughed at him as a credulous dupe in their joy over the success in his unworthy plans. The nature of Hottinger's judgment is hardly in doubt. Zwingli, the faithful martyr, became a hallmark of Protestant Reformation identity. Whereas biographers of Calvin in the 19th century had to deal with the perennial problem of Servetus, for Zwingli the major moral and spiritual hurdle was his death on the battlefield. The implication of Zwingli's death was taken up by some of the most famous British authors and British authors on the Zurich Reformers' theology during the 19th century. And I'm just going to provide a small selection. William Cunningham, professor of church history and later principal of New College, Edinburgh, was known as the ablest defender of Calvinism in his day. In a collection of essays which were put together and printed after his death in 1862, Cunningham wrote at length on Zwingli and provided an account of the reformer's death that simultaneously both exonerated him and spoke to, for Cunningham, a very contemporary debate. He, Zwingli, has sometimes been charged, even by those who have no prejudice against his cause or his principles, with interfering too much in political affairs in his country and connecting religion too closely with political movements. And indeed, his death at the Battle of Kappel has been held up as an instance of religious retribution, as an illustration of the scriptural principle that, quote, "He that taketh the sword shall perish by the sword." Though his view has been countenanced by some very eminent and influential names in the present day, we are by no means sure it has any solid foundation upon which to rest. We do not know any scriptural grounds that entitles us to lay it down as absolute, that the character of a citizen and a patriot must entirely sink into that of a Christian minister. Historical circumstances are key to deciphering Cunningham's account of Zwingli. His book, The Reformers and the Theology of the Reformation, which, as I say, appeared in 1862, was deeply informed by the major crisis within the Scottish Church in which he was a prominent figure, the disruption, which began in 1843. The core of that debate, known as the disruption, was the relationship between church and state, as we might now formulate it, and the involvement of the church in the political affairs of the nation. Cunningham was both claiming Zwingli's death as heroic and defending his controversial role in politics. His narrative of a self-sacrificing Zwingli was a full-blooded defense of the interweaving of religion and politics. Zwingli was placed in a long lineage of reformers whose restoration of the gospel could not be separated from their lives in the life of the national community. I cite Cunningham as but one example where Zwingli's role in politics was a locus for contemporary concerns on both sides of the Atlantic about the role of the church in national life. Let us jump forward considerably to the period during the First World War, where the American Presbyterian cleric and author James Isaac Good wrote a chapter in his book called The Reformed Reformation, which he called The Contribution of Zwingli to the Spirit of the Reformation. The spirit of Zwingli, for Good, was closely associated with his involvement in the shaping of a Christian government. Good writes, Zwingli stands out as the political reformer. He was the political reformer before he became a religious one. He opposed mercenary service in Glarus. It was left through his superhuman efforts that Zurich gave up citizens as soldiers. Luther and Zwingli were direct opposites on the battlefield, on the political role of Reformation. Lutheran bias against Zwingli continues to this day. The characteristic of the Zwinglian Reformation, Good continued, is that in which church and magistrates were closely bound together. But he says that in America this jars with our sensibilities. And that reputation for Zwingli has damaged his standing in the United States. Quote, and this prejudice against Zwingli thus cultivated has been helped here by the spirit of America. For we in the United States have so strongly emphasized the separation of church and state that no political activity has seemed objectionable. That political activity has seemed objectionable to many. Writing as Good did in the midst of the war into which America would soon become involved, he held out Zwingli, not as a man of conflict, but indeed of one of peace. In fact, he was the visionary, for Good, of state diplomacy. Had Zwingli prevailed and formed a Protestant alliance, Europe would have been spared further religious wars. It was only the failure and defeat of Protestantism that had left them vulnerable to further attack. In fact, for good, Zwingli's efforts were directly applicable to his present-day situation. Far from being the advocate of a disastrous religious war, Zwingli for good was a voice of peace. I quote, "He is therefore the prophet and herald of the great movement born in our day, and so greatly emphasized by this awful war, that the golden rule must only be observed within nations and between them. It is the duty of the Church to speak in trumpet tones on this subject. Zwingli thus becomes the prophet of the League of Nations to enforce peace, of which we hear so much. He, like Erasmus, was an ardent advocate of peace, but also believed in thorough preparedness for war. Zwingli thus assumes a new importance in light of our present events. The great political reformer is the harbinger of those great international reforms in which the Church must nobly bear her part if they are ever to be carried through successfully, that of this millennial time." I return to William Cunningham, so 40 years earlier, and we find that he provided what became the classic Protestant defense of Zwingli against the frequent charges of his uncontrolled bellicosity and of his bad death. Cunningham writes, "It is well known that he disapproved, and what he did, it is well known that he disapproved, and what he did, and that he did what he could to prevent the steps that led to war, in which he lost his life. And it was in obedience to express orders of civil authorities, and in the discharge of his duties as a pastor, that not without some melancholy forebodings he accompanied his countrymen to the fatal field of Kappel. We cannot dwell at this subject, though it is proper to express our doubts whether the disapprobation which some eminent men in this present day have indicated of Zwingli's conduct in this respect is altogether well-founded. We confess that we are inclined to regard this disapprobation as originating rather in a narrow and sentimental than in an enlarged and manly view of the subject. The attempt to defend Zwingli's polity, however, did not go unchallenged, even by those Protestants sympathetic to the Swiss Reformer's theology and of his role in the Reformation. Philip Schaff, with whom I began, who, as we shall see, regarded Zwingli as a modern voice, was distinctly critical of the Reformer's way of proceeding in Zurich. I quote, "It is dangerous to involve religion," Schaff writes, "in entangling political alliances. Christ and the apostles kept aloof from secular complications and confirmed themselves to be preaching the ethics of politics. Zwingli, with the best intentions, overstepped the line of his proper calling and was doomed to bitter disappointment." Indeed, for Schaff, Zwingli's close bond to the magistrates, in contrast to Luther, brought him misery and regret. Schaff writes further, "Zwingli spent the last months before his death in anxiety and fear. His counsel had been rejected, and yet he was blamed for all the troubles. He had not a few enemies in Zurich, who undermined his influence and inclined more and more to passive policy of Bern. Under these circumstances, he was resolved to withdraw from public service. And on the 26th of July, he appeared before the Great Council, declaring, 11 years I have preached to you the gospel and faithfully warned you against the dangers that threaten a confederacy." And to which Schaff concludes that that we should see that in fact Zwingli was responsible for what happened. Another objection was expressed by one of the most well-read and most popular 19th century historians of the Reformation, again a Scotsman, Thomas Lindsay, who lived from 1843 to 1914. His book, The Reformation, was largely designed for a broader public, but also for clergy, and became a mainstay of Protestant reading culture. Lindsay belonged to the Free Church of Scotland, unlike Cunningham, and was principal of the Free Church College in Glasgow from 1902 until his death. His account of Zwingli was very much, as we've heard before, built around the question of the relationship of church and state. He had a particular concern for the social circumstances of the Reformation and expressed his indebtedness to the work of von Ranke, whose presence he claimed was to be found on every page of his own work. Zwingli's error in the matter of politics had created a tradition, so Lindsay wrote, from which Christian church in Scotland was still struggling. He, Zwingli, Lindsay writes, was led from these thoroughly good and true ideas to think that there should be no government in the church separate from the civil government that ruled in the Commonwealth in which the church exists. Hence, all the rulers and regulations about public worship, about doctrines, and about the discipline of the church were made in Zwingli's time by the council. It was the chief civil power in the state. This idea, Lindsay continues, even in his own time was accompanied by many evils. One of the most conspicuous being the connection between the Protestant Reformation and purely political enterprises. Zwingli's idea was that the modern state should be what he thought the old kingdom of Israel was, theocratic governments. Had Zwingli's views continued to prevail, it is not likely that the Swiss Reformation would have exercised the power that it did beyond Switzerland. For while they worked somewhat smoothly in a small state like Zurich, as long as Zwingli's personal influence lasted, they could not have been well applied to larger states. In virtually every biography and account of Zwingli in the histories of the Reformation, the authors also devoted, if one might expect, considerable attention to the comparison of the Swiss reformer with Martin Luther. There is a striking series of recurring themes in these many biographies. Luther was the monk and the mystic. Zwingli was the logical rationalist. Luther was the man of personal spiritual anguish. Zwingli, Zwingli thought in terms of reforming the church. And one that comes across many, many times, Luther was a monarchist, Zwingli a Republican. There were numerous layers to the comparisons. Many Reformed writers used the contrast between the Reformers to portray their own confessions, to convey their own confessions and the contrasts between their churches. The continuing portrayal of Luther as a monarchist and dictator revealed contemporary concerns about the ambitions of imperial Germany. The Swiss, in contrast, were a virtuous republic. And in this vein of reasonableness, Philipp Schaff frequently referred to Zwingli as the forefather of liberal theology, with ideas more modern than the other reformers. Schaff writes, Zwingli was trained in the school of Erasmus and passed from the heathen classics directly to the New Testament. He represents more than any other reformer except Melanchthon the spirit of the Renaissance in harmony with the Reformation. He was, Schaff argues, a forerunner of modern liberal theology. Zwingli's humanism in Schaff's mind made him more tolerant, more open-minded, which was seen through his willingness to extend salvation to the virtuous heathen. In this direction, Schaff writes, Zwingli was more liberal than any other reformer and opened a new path. St. Augustine moderated the rigor of the doctrine of predestination by the doctrine of baptismal regeneration and by the hypothesis of future purification. Zwingli moderated it by extending divine revelation and the working of the Holy Spirit beyond the boundaries of the visible church and the ordinary means of grace. George Park Fisher, to take another figure, who was the first to hold the newly created chair of ecclesiastical history at Yale, had studied for several years in Germany and sought to bring German theological and historical Wissenschaft to the newly evolving subject in American universities. He too saw Zwingli and Luther as two distinctly different characters. Luther was the troubled in spirit, defined by his discovery of justification by faith alone, while Zwingli had no inclinations to be a monk. He was cheerful by disposition and fond of the ancient classics. Parker writes, he came, sounding a bit like Schaff, he came out of the Erasmian school. The authority of the church never had a strong hold on him. And even before he explicitly questioned the validity of it, he studied the scripture and felt their power. He easily gave to them the allegiance of his mind and heart. It cost him little to cast off whatever the doctrinal or ecclesiastical systems of the Latin Church appeared to him at variance with the Bible or with common sense. He had not the same vivid idea of the transcendental importance that Luther did. Zwingli, a bold and independent student, took the Bible for his chart and was deterred by no scruple of latent reverence for abruptly discarding usages for which the Bible did not sanction. Drawing on Hundeshagen's work from 1862, Parker presented the Zurich reformer as a committed patriot devoted to ridding his country of immoral conduct. He writes, after Zwingli renounced the papal pension and declined the flattering offer to make it larger, and took his stand against foreign influence, came from what quarter it might, which attained its ends at the cost of national corruption. He resembled in his position, in his mingled patriotism and piety, the old Hebrew prophets. Yet for Fischer, Zwingli was no Luther. It was the German who had felt the persecution of the Roman Church, while Zwingli was treated fairly lightly. This was not Zwingli's discredit, he wrote, but his path could not be compared to Luther's. He writes, but they demonstrate that the distinction of sounding the trumpet of revolt against the Roman See belongs to the Saxon reformer. Luther's voice, which was heard in every country of Europe, reached the valleys of Switzerland. Parker's assessment found further expression in the work of the most influential American church historian of the early 20th century, Williston Walker, who succeeded to the chair of church history at Yale in 1901. And in his 1902 book, The Reformation, Walker observed that for Luther the principal question was, quote, how do I gain from a gracious God? To Zwingli, Walker contrasted, first of all, questions were less personal. It was rather the purity of the church, its doctrines, its worship, its organization, as tested by that primal classic character. The scriptures. Both reformers reached similar results in many, but not all means, but their methods of approach were somewhat alike, owing to diversities of natural genius and training. This want of tempestuous personal experience, such as Luther had, has often been treated as if it was a reproach to Zwingli, but most unjustly. It is true that his early ministry had not the moral earnestness or moral purity that Luther showed, but one cannot question his sincerity, his zeal, or spiritual power from the time that his real work as a reformer began. Walker's admiration for Zwingli was not mere ancestor worship. Echoing Schaff, he argued that Zwingli belonged to the flourishing liberal theology that was developing at Yale and across New England. For Walker, history was a story of progress. In almost Darwinian terms, he spoke of the history of the church as, quote, a growth and adaptation to environment and new conditions. Although divinely inspired, the church was a human institution, subject to change and survived to the degree that it constantly evolved. Likewise with Parker, Walker was trained in Germany and was a scrupulous reader of sources and fascinated by testing their authenticity. In this brief tour, let us not, however, forget the Catholic writers, and I return to Archbishop Spalding and his acid judgment of what transpired in Zurich. This, he said, presaged the errors in his own land of America. The enlightened, he writes, the enlightened Council of Zurich decided in favor of the Reformed doctrines and resorted to force in order to suppress the ancient worship. Only think of a town council composed of fat aldermen and stupid burgomeisters pronouncing definitely on articles of faith. They of Zurich were perhaps too well satisfied with their superior wisdom and knowledge to ever entertain a doubt. I can offer this morning little more than a brief glimpse of what is, I can assure you, an enormous body of literature in the English-speaking world of the 19th century and of the early 20th century. And that literature includes a very prominent place for Huldrych Zwingli. To employ a cliché, I have only touched the tip of an iceberg. I have not yet, for example, mentioned the popular biography of Zwingli called Zwingli or the Rise of the Reformation in Switzerland, a life of the reformer with some notices of his time and contemporaries, which was written by the Swiss pastor Regé Christoffel and was translated by John Cochrane and appeared in Edinburgh in 1858 and went through an enormous number of editions. What I have attempted in this brief talk is to convey a sense of how Zwingli was by no means either a lost or obscure figure. I have sought to demonstrate that through writings on him, both positive and negative, distinct forms of Protestant Christianity sought self-definition in the very struggles of the 19th century. Like Luther and Calvin, Zwingli served as a screen onto which diverse contemporary questions and arguments were both projected and justified. For Catholic writers, his life and heresy condemned the modern Protestantism of their time. Let's, however, leave the last words to the father of American church history, the Swiss Philip Schaff, who attended the festival when the Zwingli monument was unveiled here in 1885, which he comments was created by a Catholic in Vienna. The ambiguity amongst Protestants in the 19th century of Zwingli as hero or troubled figure, as defender of politics in the state, or as the leader of an error from which the Protestant tradition had struggled since the Reformation, finds expression in Schaff's ambivalent judgment. In him, in Zwingli, Schaff writes, in him, the reformer, the statesman and the patriot are one. He appealed to the examples of Joshua and Gideon, but he forgot the difference between the old and new dispensation. Thank you.